My father always seemed to have an angel looking over his shoulder. There was always somebody there to direct him in the right direction or protect him or feed him. He was lucky. It was 1945, September. The war, World War II, had ended in May of that year, and my father, an 18-year-old German soldier, was being put onto a cattle car with many other German soldiers. They were told that they were going home. But as the train left the station, it became obvious that the train was not going in the right direction for home. Lothar Wolfgang Rehmer was born in October of 1926 in Germany in the industrial town of Magdeburg. My grandfather, Paul, worked in a heavy machines factory, and my grandmother, Magdalena, was a bookkeeper. Like all good Catholic families in Germany, my grandparents were very much against the Nazi Party. So much so that when my dad's sister Edith became pregnant, my grandparents forbid her to marry the father because he was a Nazi soldier. When my father was 15 or 16, he got pulled out of school to help with the war effort. By the time he was 17, he was officially enlisted in the German army, and on a whim, him and his friend volunteered for the Navy. A few weeks later, he got notice that he was to report to the SS. Because he was now in the Navy, he was able to turn down going to the SS, and my grandparents were thrilled about that. My dad had been assigned to a ship, but before they made it to port, they had been bombed and destroyed by the Allies. 2/3 of the ships and U-boats were being destroyed by the Allies at this point in the war. An officer specifically told my dad to avoid getting on a ship if he could help it. Instead, he ended up as part of a radio troop, and the radio troop marched down to Bordighera, Italy, on the Mediterranean. Their job was to monitor the comings and goings of Allied ships. For some reason, the Allies seemed to ignore them. The only blood that he saw was when one of his companions cut his foot on a broken seashell when he was swimming in the beach. So he was quite lucky in that way. The week before the war ended, there was enough rumors flying that they abandoned their post and they made a run for Switzerland. 2 days after the war officially ended, he got rounded up by Americans, and he was not called a prisoner of war because the war had ended. He was called an internee.
For the next couple of months, we lived in a barracks warehouse complex in Bressanone. Conditions there were very informal. For example, it was one of my assignments to paint some chairs and other furniture in an American officer's mess. I walked there and back by myself. Whenever I felt so inclined, I went into the kitchen for some coffee and donuts or whatever.
In September of 1945, my father and the other German soldiers were put on a train to Rosenheim. They were told that they were going to be repatriated with their country.
During several of our stops in Austria and southern Bavaria, I noticed that a number of former prisoners left the train carrying their belongings and just wandered away. Those of us who did not follow their good example ended up in a camp near Rosenheim. We suddenly found ourselves surrounded by barbed wire fences and under guard.
The German soldiers were told to divide themselves into soldiers who were from the Eastern Zone and those from the Western Zone. My dad's town of Magdeburg was now part of the Eastern Zone.
Those residing in the western zones were told they would be discharged, while those from the eastern zone were told they would be taken to Hof, a town at the border between the western and eastern zones, to be exchanged against prisoners held by the Russians for subsequent discharge.
Soon after its departure, it was clear to them the train was not going north, but in fact it was going west. They didn't know where they were going.
After a day or so, it became clear that France would welcome us, sort of.
They just had to wait a couple of days until they arrived at a large prisoner of war camp outside of Le Mans, France. They got out of their cattle cars and they had PG painted on their backs, Prisonnier de Guerre, prisoner of war. So now, just about 5 months after the war had ended, my dad had become a prisoner of war.
Food was atrocious. We got 2 slices of bread per day, but no meat, cheese, or even jam. Warm soup was distributed 2 or 3 times daily, but consisted largely of water. Finding a potato peel in it was an achievement. Our bunch was well fed and in pretty good shape to begin with, but we went rapidly downhill on our diet.
The rumor was that 200 men were dying a day from starvation.
Because I could speak some French, I was part of the small delegation that went to see the camp commander. He listened to our complaints. According to him, most of what we were getting had been scrounged from surrounding farms. He more or less apologized for this state of affairs and insisted that he had made numerous representations to his superiors, so far without success.
He found out that they were looking for volunteers to work in the mines. My dad had got his commission as an officer 2 weeks before the war ended, so technically, as an officer, he was allowed to refuse manual labor, but he thought, well, I've got to get out of here, so I've got to go to the mines.
The afternoon before our departure, a whole convoy of trucks with Red Cross demarcations entered the camp and unloaded large quantities of food of all types. The next morning, we were loaded into cattle cars. Both doors were locked and remained closed until we reached our destination, Levin in the Pas-de-Calais, a couple of days later. Thanks to the imprudent consumption of the wonderful food that had suddenly become available, about half the guys in my car came down with diarrhea. With no easy way of disposing of the results, it was a pretty filthy and stinky bunch of guys that was unloaded in Levin.
The conditions in the mines were quite horrible. They had no protective gear, no mask, no goggles.
When we drilled, the air was filled with rock dust so dense that one could not see more than 6 inches. We did not have goggles nor masks, but had to make do with a piece of cloth covering mouth and nose.
If you had a problem with eyes or epilepsy, that was your ticket out of the coal mines. So my dad complained about some vague problem with his eyes, and he got sent to a local town doctor. The doctor didn't even ask him about his eyes. He asked him his age and his background, and then he wrote out a certificate saying this young man is unfit to work in the mines. My father was sent to some smaller camps, and it was during the summer of 1946 that they were allowed to send letters home. So my dad sent a letter home, and a month later he got a response, and he found out that his mother had died over a year before. In the spring of 1947, all their ditch digging work was done, so my dad got sent to a brewery in Rush, France.
Ever so often we borrowed a bicycle and traveled up to the Belgian border. There we could buy such things as coffee and cocoa to send to relatives in Germany. That is, our life in 1947 was reasonably comfortable, and in some respects we were possibly better off than many of the people living in Germany at that time.
In early 1948, almost 3 years after the war had ended, they were offered free worker status. You were given 4-week vacation to go home, all expenses paid. And like pretty well every one of the German prisoners there, my dad took them up on the offer. My dad was now from East Germany. That was the one place where you weren't allowed to go. So my dad gave a fake address in Berlin, got on the train. The train stopped at Magdeburg, his hometown, so he just got off the train and had no problem going home. He had no plans to go back, but after hanging around in Magdeburg for a month, a police officer told him, if he can get out of here, get out of here. East Germany is a police state. You don't want to be here.
In May, when I finally made up my mind that I wanted to return to France, the Berlin blockade was underway. The French consulate in West Berlin supplied me with phony travel documents, and I went back to the brewery in Rasch.
It was a good life, but it was kind of a dead-end job. So one day in the paper, there was an ad looking for young men and women who wanted to train to be nurses in England. And so in the fall of 1951, he moved to England. There he met another nurse trainee who had come from Austria. 6 months later, they got married. They lived happily ever after. My dad was one of those people who you would instantly like because he had such a light way of looking at the world. He saw humor in everything. So I'm sure he attracted people to him who wanted to help him.